pleasure to be here in Western Australia. Many, many good things in Western Australia have come from Victoria over the years. Gold mining and Australian rules football, to name but two. The next session has three speakers, so unfortunately the time for each speaker will be less than usual. There will be 20 minutes for each speech, plus 10 minutes only for discussion, and regrettably those time limits will need to be vigorously enforced. The theme of the next session is on the protection of rights, and the first speaker is Professor Neville Rochow, whose state of origin is South Australia, but he is now more Western Australian than South Australian, he tells me. Professor Rochow SC has degrees from the University of Adelaide and Deakin University. He's been a barrister since 1988, a senior counsel since 2008, and is currently a professor of law at Notre Dame University and an associate professor at the University of Adelaide Law School. He'll be speaking on the subject of lessons from the European Union, which will be a very interesting subject. Speaking for myself, the best lesson I ever learned on the European Union was from the great TV series Yes Minister, when James Hacker famously said this: "You know what they say about the average European Common Market official? He has the organising ability of the Italians, the flexibility of the Germans, and the modesty of the French. And that's topped up by the imagination of the Belgians, the generosity of the Dutch, and the intelligence of the Irish." To speak on lessons from the European Union, please welcome Professor Neville Rochow SC.
Thanks, Ben, there for playing the role of Sir Humphrey, and it's most appropriate, actually. In fact, I accord completely with those observations. I think that's about it. I could probably sit down right now. It's a very great honour to be able to address such an august body as is here assembled, and I have really very much enjoyed the presentations that have gone before. I thought that last night's dinner was a tremendous start for the evening, and I would really like to associate myself with the remarks that Peter Credlin made last night. She put things, I think, very succinctly and very well, and as if that weren't enough, then we had a wonderful thank you address by David Flint that was just superb. And today, Michelle Evans has done just an excellent job as well. I just want to dissent from one proposition that she put forward, and it's the only thing with which I respectfully disagree, and that is that she said that she didn't think that Article 5.3 had been a success when talking about the Lisbon Treaty. I'm going to take the risk of going further and say that it's been an utter failure and a landmark of hypocrisy, but I'll just restrain myself and not go too far. But perhaps I can echo a lesson that was taught to me by that faded communist Mick Hume and his colleague Brendan O'Neill, when they said you should warn an audience when you're about to say something controversial. I'm going to say some things that are controversial, and this is what I want to observe at the beginning. My remarks today, if they were made in the EU, would be met with the following possible consequences. First of all, if they were made in Scotland, I would possibly be considered by the Family Welfare Administration to be unsafe and unfit to be either a parent or a grandparent and be placed on an extremist watch list. If it were made in England or Wales, the Prevent Program administrators would probably also place me on a watch list as an extremist. In Germany, if I were to insult anyone, my remarks would be considered to be something that rendered me liable to prosecution. In Spain, as of next month, I would almost certainly be prosecuted for not promoting LGBT causes, which will become an offence as of September. And if that were not enough, all Twitter and Facebook accounts reporting my remarks would be frozen and possibly also rendered as evidence in prosecutions. So listener beware, you listen at your own risk. I'm a danger to all of you. And I make no apologies about that, because I really think some of the things that need to be said today are quite important. And I'm supposed to be talking about lessons that are to be learned from the EU, and I will talk about that. But before I go into those details, can I just say that I consider that our written constitution is one of the greatest protections one could ever imagine against tyranny, demagoguery, and ideology, but on certain conditions. I think the first condition is that our constitution must be upheld by the legislature, by the executive, by the judiciary, and most importantly by the people. And if the message that I'd like to get out is anything at all, is that the message that has been coming from this conference needs to be got out among the people, that the conservative view of life is not one of ducking the problem, but actually dealing with the problem in a way that works with respect to the past, the present, and the future. And so you can see my Burkean pedigree coming through in that. I am a great admirer of Burke and Sir Roger Scruton and the like, and I think we are well instructed by history if we will learn from it, if we will read it. And not just our own, but that of our forebears, and also our neighbours, but also Europe and the US are great teachers for us. And one of the great pities, I think, of our society today is that there is a discouragement from any engagement with history. And so there's a disconnect that is developing, and that disconnect is being filled by elites who are going to tell people what to think, because they know not what to think for themselves anymore. They have no reference point. And that is the critical problem with the EU. The EU is dominated by bureaucrats in Brussels who are not only unelected and unaccountable, but they are quite often disconnected with the constituency they are supposed to represent. So today I will make those sorts of criticisms. I apologise if that hurts anyone's ears. I rejoice if it gladdens anyone's hearts. And I think on that basis we can probably get going. So I think that the impact of these problems in the EU, as I've observed by having worked there for a couple of years until earlier this year, with a number of NGOs working on human rights and religious freedom issues, is that identity is at risk, security is used as a pretext, and freedom is a diminishing quantity. And if we look around at what's happening in Australia, I think we could say safely that they are threats that we all face at the moment. The problem is that we have a central legislature that has no legislative power per se. The EU works on the basis that all of its legislation originates in the European Commission, which is a bureaucracy. In our parlance, it might be an executive, but it's not really an executive in any sense we understand that's democratic. It is placed there, and there are a lot of ideologues that populate those places. Now, there are glaring exceptions. I think of Jan Figel, for example, and Katharina von Schnurbein, who are wonderful examples of trying to promote freedoms. And I'll come to the split personality of Europe in a moment. But because of those ideologies that they drive, there are threats to identity in terms of sexual or gender identity, the individual, the national identity. All of those are there. And so we are seeing the worst of what is very close to an Orwellian scenario developing, that is also developing here if we are not very vigilant. And we can see exactly this in Spain with the LGBT agenda. Spain was the third country in the world to permit same-sex marriage. And there is at the moment this naive concept that same-sex marriage happens in a vacuum, in some sort of test tube that's off there away from everything else. It has consequences. And a little later in my presentation, hopefully staying within the time that we've got, I will tell you some of the consequences that are going to happen in terms of fines and imprisonment for people who don't promote that agenda. just over a decade after it came into operation. So I want to talk about those issues, but also I want to have another thought that stays in our minds, and that is that the emperor always demands silence, and by that I mean the emperor with no clothes, because correctly analysed, the European Union has no clothes, but no one dare speak of it because there are a number of constraints upon what one can say. One of those is one that's reported by Douglas Murray in his very good book, The Strange Death of Europe. And there's an example given by him of a conversation between Chancellor Merkel of Germany and Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook. And Murray reports this: even in 2015, at the height of the migration crisis, it was speech and thought that were constricted. At the peak of the crisis in September 2015, Chancellor Merkel asked the Facebook CEO, Mark Zuckerberg, what could be done to stop European citizens writing criticisms of her migration policy on Facebook. Are you working on this, she asked him. He assured her that he was. Now, if Big Brother ain't watching you in Germany, he's certainly watching you on Facebook and throughout all of the EU, and that is now reinforced by a policy, a code of conduct that has been agreed by all the major internet suppliers to make sure that no one gets away with anything that might be classified as a hate crime, and that they are closed down very quickly. And Timothy Snyder, in his book on tyranny, says that we cannot assume that these things will not happen elsewhere. He talks about both the Nazis and the communists earlier in the previous century, and he says that they proposed a rule by disciplined party elite with a monopoly on reason that would guide society toward a certain future according to supposedly fixed laws of history. We might be tempted to think that our democratic heritage automatically protects us from such threats. This is a misguided reflex. Our own tradition demands that we examine history to understand the deep sources of tyranny and to consider the proper responses to it. We are no wiser than the Europeans who saw democracy yield to fascism, Nazism, or communism in the 20th century. Our one advantage is that we might learn from their experience. And that's what I'm hoping we might be able to do today. This was our view from our apartment in Brussels. And I must say that when we went to Brussels in 2015, we went there with a great deal of optimism. I really thought the European project might work. I thought, well, it goes contrary to everything that I think about centrism and bureaucracy, but maybe it just seems to work. And so there was our view, and we're just around the corner from the European Commission there. We're just 10 minutes walk from the Parliament. We're right in the heart of everything that happens in Europe. The building you see in the front is Palmerston's Brussels residence where he used to live. But what you see in the distance, you see a pinnacle of a basilica, that is Saint-Marie. And Saint-Marie is in the middle of Schaerbeek. And Schaerbeek, some of you will have read in the newspapers, was a place where a lot of arrests were made last year. Schaerbeek is predominantly a Muslim area, and Saint-Marie is boarded up and in complete disrepair. That to me is a metaphor for what is going on in Europe, and that to me is a metaphor for what can happen here. Now, you may have seen images of these three likeable characters. These were the three bombers that were in the Zaventem airport incident on the 22nd of March 2016. On the day that happened, I was in London. I was working with a group in the House of Commons on that day, and I got a text message on my phone saying that Eurostar had been cancelled. And so I turned on the TV to find out what was happening, and then I found reports of all this. So I called my wife back in Brussels and I said, what's going on? And she told me that one of our very good friends had just been injured in the explosion. The muscle in his lower leg had been blown off, and he'd been taken to a military hospital. And she said that she was trying to contact his wife to see what she could do. In the 5 minutes of that phone call, my wife normally would have caught the train at Schumann to go through the next station, which is Malbec. And if she'd been on that train, she too would have been caught in the next explosion. So in that 5 minutes we talked, she was spared the utter destruction that these vermin inflict upon other people. But we're not allowed to talk about that in Europe. We're not allowed to name it for what it is, because somebody, somewhere, somehow might be offended. And so we find ourselves hampered in free speech, even when free speech is a necessary thing for ordinary ideas to be discussed. And we see that coming more and more in Australia. I observed that there are many people who are trying to suppress all forms of debate and all forms of discussion under any pretext that they can come up with. And anyone who says to you that we can't talk about that is somebody that needs to be suspected for their motives, or at least their intelligence. But the other thing too is that these three chaps at least one of them was able to travel freely to Syria to get the plans blueprinted out for them for making the bombs. They were able to get training. They were able to move freely from the Paris attacks that they perpetrated in November back up to Brussels. No border checks, no difficulty at all moving through what is essentially a set of porous borders under the Schengen Agreement. And I'm not suggesting for a moment we need border checks in our states, but what I am saying is that we need to be vigilant in the way that we currently are in protecting our outer borders, which is a strength that Europe can never emulate because they're different countries that control the outside borders. And I talk about this a lot more in the paper, so I hope you'll forgive me if I'm skating across the top. There's a lot of detail in the written paper that will come later. Now, if there was any hope of possibly correcting this way of viewing things, I think that it might have been with these three characters possibly, Geert Wilders and Marie Le Pen and Frauke Petry, respectively from the Netherlands, France and Germany. I'm not suggesting they necessarily would have been a good government, but what happened to stop the rise of any correction in this sort of approach was something that occurred on the 23rd and 24th of June 2016, commonly known as Brexit. Now, on the day of Brexit, I attended a policy briefing at the European Policy Centre, which is a think tank in Brussels. And the meeting was in an absolute state of apoplexy. They could not believe that this had happened. They could not believe that, contrary to every pundit's prediction, everything that condescending knew, that Britain had actually chosen to leave the EU. How could that be? And they talked about the 60,000 pages of legislation that had to be revised, the trade agreements that had to be gone through, how lawyers would be working on this for 10 years, not a bad thing, and that everything was that the world was coming to an end as far as 3 minutes. Okay, great. I'm going to talk very quickly. That this was a very terrible thing. Well, they were right, but then just a week later, I was in a meeting of the Equinet group, which is all of the groups that control discrimination law throughout Europe. And they said, let's forget about what happened a week ago. Let's forget about that entirely. We're not going to even mention it by name. We need to talk about where we're going from here. We're not getting our message through, so we need a new layer of bureaucracy. People aren't listening to Brussels well enough, so we're going to have to get more bureaucrats onto the job of getting them to listen. Really very useful. All right, so just a few quick points. These are graphic points that will be made fairly easily. You'll see here the sort of coastline that has to be guarded by the EU, and here is the comparison that you can make with Australia. We have a single coastline. They have a number of coastlines controlled by various countries. And the EU essentially has two souls. And in the paper I developed this a lot more, but it is divided between the angels of its good nature on questions of subsidiarity, which we talked about this morning, human rights, freedom, and good things. And then we have the devils in its origins of a borderless society, getting rid of nationalities, relentlessly persistent in its ideologically driven bureaucracy. And so we have these two souls warring on these issues throughout, which is part of the problem we have in the EU. And they derive from its beginnings, which were at the very commencement deceptive, because the message was we're going to try and create a common market, but in reality the plan of Schuman and the others was to create a borderless, countryless Europe that would just have one nationality, which would be European. And so we face the same sort of difficulty in that nature does abhor a vacuum, and with the weakened Judeo-Christianity that we suffer here, untested ideologies are coming in to fill that. And they have impact upon our identity. And this is just one example where Merkel in 2010 in her famous Potsdam speech says, we are now seeing that multiculturalism does not work. We're repenting of that. We're sorry. We're going to stop it. It's a silly thing. And then in 2015, she allows 1.5 million immigrants, largely untested as to their claims, to come into Germany. We have the Equal Treatment Directive, which protects every minority group apart from Christians and ensures that the burden of proof is reversed, so that if anyone's feelings are offended, they have a cause of action which will be supported by the state and prosecuted vigorously. Hate speech will bring these sorts of things to an end. And if I've just got a moment, I'll just tell you that this Spanish legislation will have fines between 3,000 and 45,000 euros for failing to do any of the following things: not facilitating or working with agents into LGBT offences, that if you don't actively promote or encourage or if you incite directly or indirectly hate against LGBT people, you have a $45,000 fine, and the group that is doing that, and this is aimed at bankrupting Christian groups, will be deregistered. So we have those sorts of things. If time permitted, I would go through issues of security, and I'd also share with you some of the views of at least Roger Scruton and Varoufakis. But we have an internet policy which is definitely Orwellian, if not totalitarian, that is coming through in the EU. All lessons for us to learn, because we have an emperor who is coming to power, who doesn't have any clothes. We'll have to be quiet, and I look forward to having a discussion with you about all those things. Thank you very much for your time.